So it's not necessarily apocalyptic. But I will say that one thing I learned from my time in the Soviet Union and learned from Russians is that there was always this sense that hardship could be around the corner.
Food, like life, can be complicated. That's why I'm on a quest to learn all about our food and the crimes, issues, and debates that are tied to it. I hope you'll join me on my quest to explore the dark side of dining. We have heard a lot about Russia in the last few years, largely due to the conflicts they've had over the Ukraine. But war is just one of many issues Russia has been dealing with in its long and storied history. And one of the biggest issues has been food. Russia is not a great place for food, and so it is a constant issue. So I brought on Darra Goldstein again to tell us all about Russia's problematic food history. But I'll let her introduce herself.
I've worn many different hats for my paid career. I was a professor of Russian literature at Williams College, but towards the end of my career there, I moved into teaching food studies. And that's because from the very beginning, I was drawn to the study of food and the way it can help us understand other cultures. And that led me to have a second career, a dual career in food writing. And I've written, I think, 7 cookbooks, something like that. And I founded a journal called Gastronomica, the Journal of Food and Culture, which was really the first serious attempt to look at food through the lenses of poetry and art and scholarly work, but also more lighthearted things, so that the very serious academics and people in the food world, like chefs and other writers, could somehow come together and find each other and have a great community.
Russia is a big part of Darra's personal story, and so she's had a vested interest in all things Russia, even as she shifted to the world of food. Here's the rest of our conversation all about Russia and food.
So you mentioned Russia, which obviously has been a big part of your journey. I mean, I read on your website you spent some time over there when you were younger, kind of doing some things and kind of growing to love the area and the people. So getting into the topic of, food and Russia, I understand that Russia's had a rather storied history of food related issues, not the least of which is a fair number of famines. Could you kind of elaborate a bit on that and possibly any other food issues that there have been historically?
Yeah, I think I was struck when I first went there in 1972. It was a long time ago. It was at the height of the Cold War. And there was very little food in the stores. And I couldn't understand how people survived. And the way people showed respect and interest in other people was by sharing food, often at great, not just expense, but great labor, because shopping involves standing in hours-long lines every day, many different lines within stores, and it was just an ordeal. And yet it was very important to express hospitality because guests are considered a gift from God. So I became, and there's also a lot of food in Russian literature, really wonderful scenes. I think that in the 19th century, sex was forbidden to be written about. And so all of that eroticism was sublimated through food. And you can find some really great scenes. So I looked deeper into Russian history and realized that partly because of Russia's geographic location, I mean, it's very far north. Until you get further to the south, the soil is not particularly fertile. And so periodically over the centuries, there have been terrible famines just because of bad weather and crops failing. That's one aspect of it. Another is that the peasants who made up, or the serfs before they were liberated and became peasants, but they made up the majority of the population, were pretty superstitious and had their own way of conducting agriculture that they believed, again, was somehow communicated to them from on high, and they didn't want to try new scientific methods. They didn't necessarily rotate crops, so that the soil could lie fallow and gain nutrients again. So that contributed to it as well. The last big natural famine was in the early 1890s, and I'm not really good with numbers, but hundreds of thousands, if not more, people died. But in the 20th century, what happened is that famine became a political weapon. And during the Russian Civil War, which took place right after the 1917 revolution, and it was the White Army, which they were in favor of restoring the monarchy, and the Reds, who were the Bolsheviks, and they wanted to promote a communist order. There was a terrible civil war and just awful famine, and the government did not really step in to help. And in fact, they requisitioned a lot of food from the people who needed it most. And within a decade, Stalin had come to power and begun his really cruel program of collectivization, by which he took the best farmland, primarily in Ukraine, I might add, because that has really good soil. It's called Chernozem. It's a swath of some of the most beautiful, rich soil in the world. And it was a breadbasket for the new Soviet Union. And he forced the farmers to become part of collective farms, to work for the state, and they no longer were able to have their own farmsteads. And he also exiled and executed a lot of them. But as people were, and he requisitioned the grain for the cities like Moscow. And as people were dying, the soldiers had the grain that they'd taken, then they were just leaving it to rot. And something like 5 million people died of starvation.
Wow.
So bringing it up to the present day with the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion, they also have been using food as a weapon. If you remember, in the early days, they weren't allowing ships to sail out of the port of Odessa on the Black Sea. And whereas during collectivization, that was all focused in Russia and Ukraine, now it became a global issue because so much of the grain was going to places like Africa, where people are living on the edge anyway. So it's pretty harsh history.
Interesting. So basically, it sounds like the key factors really historically were first, the environment itself was just kind of hostile to growing food. And then the political environment became hostile. Very interesting. So you mentioned a little bit that there were some issues early on in the Russia-Ukraine war with food. Are there any current ones that you're aware of, especially related to the conflict that's ongoing there?
Yeah, I mean, there are all kinds of issues. After Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, illegally, a lot of sanctions were placed on Russia by Western powers, United States, Canada, Australia, much of Europe. And so a lot of food that had been imported from the West was no longer allowed into Russia. And I have to say that the Russians are very ingenious and talented in general. And Russia has never historically had a tradition of making hard-aged cheeses. The cheese that they eat there is soft cheese, more like a cottage cheese, and they have all kinds of other wonderful dairy products, but they didn't do hard cheeses. But before the sanctions were imposed, after the Soviet Union broke up, all of these Western goods flooded in. The Russians came to love hard cheeses. Once they could no longer get them from the West, they learned how to make them in Russia. So you have Russian Feta, you have Russian Brie, you have Russian cheddar, all of these cheeses that are very tied to distinctive places, but they're all made in Russia now, and they're excellent, actually, what they've managed to do. But there are, still issues with the loss of the safety net after the fall of the Soviet Union. During the Soviet period, people weren't starving. They just had a monotonous diet, but there were enough services from the government that there was food. But after the collapse of that regime, people just didn't have pensions that were sufficient. They didn't have access to things. And you would see old women selling, in the summertime, tiny little baskets of berries, desperate for a little bit of money. So that safety net is gone, and really there is hunger among a certain portion of the population now, whereas there hadn't been in the past.
Interesting. So kind of looking to our days and everything, both contemporarily with current things that are going on there, as well as historically, what can we learn from this history to avoid similar issues elsewhere in the world?
Well, I'm not very good at strategizing those large global issues, but I will say that one thing I learned from my time in the Soviet Union and learned from Russians is that there was always this sense that hardship could be around the corner. So it's not necessarily apocalyptic. I don't mean to make it sound too grand, but almost every single family had either a dacha, which is a little place out in the country that might just be a hut, or it could be something more elaborate, but they had a garden plot, or there was a garden plot within the city. And from the time that the ground thawed, which wasn't until close to June, until climate change started changing all that, but they would plant potatoes. And they knew that they would have enough sustenance. They would forage for mushrooms and berries and put them up, and grow cucumbers and make pickles, and make sure that they had enough homemade food that they could make it last throughout the long winter. So I think that's a good lesson for all of us, is to learn to be self-sufficient and not necessarily. We have expectations in the States that will be taken care of. That isn't true for a large segment of the population, but I think even for those of us who are fortunate enough not to be worried about where our next meal is coming from, it's good to realize that we too can be self-sufficient, or at least partly.
Yeah. I'm actually kind of curious, because you mentioned these garden plots, about how big were they usually to sustain like a small family? Because that we have a lot of bigger cities here in the States, that maybe there's not a whole lot of space for somebody to theoretically have a garden plot to be more self-sufficient. I'm just curious for reference how big those were.
Again, it's those numbers that I'm not good at expressing things quantitatively, but I'd say that, you can grow potatoes in a fairly small area. So if you have a small backyard, not that you want to be taken over by potatoes or tomatoes and cucumbers, maybe you do, but you don't need tons of land. And I know that didn't really answer your question, but
yeah, but I guess the nice thing about potatoes is you can make them grow deeper, from my understanding. So yeah. Are there any more comments you have about Russian food history? Anything of interest that you'd like to mention?
No, I think for now that covers it.
Awesome.
I hope you enjoyed this brief journey through Russia's storied history of food problems. There are a lot of things we can learn from the mistakes and shortcomings of history, especially one so varied and drastic as Russia's. Just remember, those who don't learn from the past are doomed to repeat it.
The Dark Side of Dining is a production of Food for Thought Audio. This episode was written, produced, and edited by me, Kenny Mears. I'd like to thank today's guest, Darra Goldstein, for sharing her insights with us. Darra is an author and speaker, and you can find more information on Darra at dacha-style.com, or follow her on social media. Links will be in the show notes. Be sure to follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, X, or wherever you get your podcasts for more content. And until next time, thanks for listening.